And you say that Luther called the book of James a straw man epistle. What was Luther's opinion of James later in his life? I believe I have read Luther on James, and he wholly accepted the book. I believe he saw the error in his early opinions on James as his study of Scripture continued.
I can't respond. I don't know. It's probable that the writer is correct because, of course, Lutheran Bibles have James right where Catholic Bibles have them. So Luther rethought a lot of things later in his life, and his later writing, even on justification, sounds a lot more like the Catholic tradition. So I'm willing to.
Could be possible.
Yeah,
I think there's something to say about Luther in that sense. I mean, when he changed the Old Testament canon, he really had some legitimate reason because he could point to something.
Right.
But he didn't have any legitimate reason to change the New Testament, and he didn't.
That's right. Yeah.
So I mean, there's a sense there which he is at least operating on his subliminal level of acceptance of authority.
That's true.
Of Old Testament tradition, which many of his followers didn't continue.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Luther is a marvelous individual in history, one of the great minds in the history of the church, and the Catholic Church owes Luther a great deal because Luther, despite the fact that, of course, there are doctrinal differences, which perhaps are being ironed out in very significant ways in recent years, Luther saw real corruption in the church, and he called the church's attention to it. And we have the Counter-Reformation as a result of that, which has made our faith stronger.
Let's take another caller. Hello.
Comments earlier about the canon within the canon. It's a complicated issue, and it's impossible to summarize it just in these few minutes. But essentially, it's this: the battle in the Reformation, during the Reformation, there were two, as I tell my students, two pillars of the Reformation: sola fide, sola scriptura. Sola fide as the material principle, sola scriptura as the formal principle of the Reformation. Luther brought to, for reasons that are too complicated to go into, Luther brought to his translation of the Bible, a fine, famous, and important translation into what was called Volksdeutsch, the People's German. He brought to that this doctrine of sola fide, faith alone, topic for another show, and therefore had to translate the Bible according to that theology. He had some historical merit to say, well, these 7 books from the Old Testament were disputed, and indeed they were, and indeed they're not found in some ancient Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, so there's no question about that. Since he could claim that kind of historical background, he felt liberated, I guess, to remove them. But the reason he wanted them removed all of them removed, was because of 2nd Maccabees. 2nd Maccabees is the story of the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC. And during the course of 2nd Maccabees are described 3 very important doctrines, or assumed, just described in narrative, the doctrines of the prayers of the faithful departed, prayers of the saints, the doctrine of the prayers for the faithful departed, the doctrine of purgatory, very clearly indicated there, and the doctrine of indulgences. All 3 of those doctrines were doctrines that Luther had already rejected as being compatible with his understanding of faith alone. So, since we can't have indulgences, purgatory, or the communion of the saints, this book can't be authentic. Well, you couldn't separate 2nd Maccabees from the other 6, and so they all went.
And he questioned even some others, right?
He questioned a couple of New Testament books. He didn't like James at all, very famously called the Epistle of James an epistle of straw, completely devoid of the gospel. He didn't like Hebrews either, but he didn't strike them because he didn't have the historical argument to fall back on to be able to take them out. He put James sort of as an appendix in the back of the Bible, which showed that he didn't regard it as really belonging there, but he also didn't have the historical. And this is interesting too. You talked earlier about clearing away and getting issues and things. I think it's safe to say that in the tradition that I initially came into the church through, that there's nobody who would not say that Catholics added these books to the Bible at some point. Yeah. Or, of course, historically, that's just not the case.
Yeah, that's the presumption.
That's the presumption.
And that's probably what many of our audience get in the neighborhoods in which they live.
Yeah.
And that's why the importance of us to know the reasons and the history behind our faith.
And by the way, they're wonderful books. 2nd Maccabees is marvelous to read. There's a beautiful sort of novel called Tobit about a man's great faith. Susanna, which is a part of the book of Daniel that's dropped from those Protestant editions of the Bible. some wonderful
Sirach.
literature there. Sirach, yeah,
Oh,
the wisdom of Ben Sirach, yeah. So
Wonderful stuff.
terrific stuff, absolutely.
We have another caller. Hello, what's your name? Talk a little bit about how becoming a Catholic has helped reach and draw you closer to Jesus Christ.
Well, you know, one of the interesting things about this whole thing for me is that I was never very uncomfortable by this phrase, a personal relationship with Jesus, because it conjures in my mind, and conjured in my mind, some sort of isolated stand before God apart from this thing that we call the church. What my Catholicism has taught me is that, okay, fine, we have a personal relationship with Jesus, but that's mediated through this community of saints that he's gathered us, called us to be gathered to. And moreover, it's not my personal relationship with Jesus that saves me, it's the presence of Jesus in the world through the sacramental presence of the church. And nothing has been more important to me as a Catholic, and I didn't know any of this before I became a Catholic, this is what you learn. Nothing has been more important than understanding and discovering how Christ is in the world, in the church, and the incarnation is extended through time in the church. And that's very real to me. That's made my faith very real, very palpable, and I hope deeper and richer because of that.
And will enrich your law practice someday.
Well, perhaps. I don't know. We'll see.
Ken,
Thank you, Marcus.
It was
good
a
to be
real
here.
enjoyable
I enjoyed
time,
it, too.
and what a great explanation of this very important topic.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.